Best conference in college football? Well, that used to be no question. Now the ACC and the Big Ten have jumped up to rival the SEC. We bring in Andrew Miller. You can catch him on Fansided and Saturday Blitz with his college football coverage right there. Andrew, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. Doing good. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. So we know what the narratives has been in college football for the past 10 years. The SEC has won a number of consecutive national championship games. I think it reached 7. And certainly even with breaking that string, fared well on the big stage for the last few years. But the ACC put on quite a show in the postseason last year and won the national championship and some other big bowl games. The Big Ten vying well and in some of the non-conference competition as well. So your thoughts about the SEC and where the conference stands right now?
Entering the season, they're kind of in that spot right now, maybe third or fourth best conference in college football. The ACC looking like the best right now, walking away with the national title. The Pac-12 looks good with USC being a playoff favorite. The Big Ten with 4 teams in the coaches poll top 10, and then 4 teams. Where's Michigan? And really Michigan's number 11 in the AP poll. So 4 teams in the AP top 11. I think the SEC right now has a few teams that can make that jump into the top 10. Don't know if Mississippi State's quite ready to make that jump yet. They got to prove themselves early on in the season. But outside of that, I like what Auburn's got going on. LSU, just kind of wait for them to find the right quarterback, finally get all the skill positions that they have. They got talent everywhere around Danny Etling, but once LSU can kind of piece the puzzle together, I think that the SEC is ready to make a run back at the top of college football.
So, Andrew, you think that the SEC right now is the 4th best conference in college football? Is that what I heard off the top?
When you look at where they are in the rankings right now and where they finished up the 2016 season, yeah, that's where they put it. That's really where they position themselves.
So I'm going to pick up the flag for the SEC and argue this one just a bit. Yeah, the ACC certainly had the best postseason. I don't think there's any question about that. Wins over Ohio State and Alabama by Clemson, what Florida State did in the Orange Bowl, and really the conference top to bottom and winning 10 out of 13 postseason games. And as I mentioned off the top, the Big Ten played well in the non-conference games in the regular season. I think what needs to be considered about the SEC last year is that, of course, Alabama may have been the best team in the country. They didn't complete the deal in the championship game, but they were one of 2 of the best teams. Then not necessarily did 1 or 2 teams distinguish themselves to challenge Alabama as we've seen in the past. So typically what we've seen in the SEC over the last 10 or 12 years is 2 teams in the top 5, 3 in the top 5, 5 in the top 10. And we saw a glut of 8 and 4 teams is basically what we saw. I don't remember what Florida's record was. I believe it was 9 and 3, but a glut of 8 and 9 win teams. None of them distinguish themselves, but I don't necessarily know that that speaks to any weakness in the conference. I think they just beat up on each other, and some of the bowl matchups weren't necessarily in their favor, meaning that LSU goes to Louisville and takes on the ACC, a like-seeded team there, and annihilates them. Auburn has to play the champion of the Big 12, and Auburn may not have been the 3rd or 4th best team in the SEC. Georgia won a bowl game. Tennessee won a bowl game. A number of teams looked good in postseason play in the SEC. So I would think top to bottom that this is still the best conference. I don't see any Rutgers, Illinois, Purdue's. I don't see a Kansas or Iowa State situation. I don't even see Virginia or Syracuse in the SEC. So if you're arguing that top 4 or 5, I can certainly see the ACC. I can see the Big Ten with the top 4 or 5 teams in that conference being just as strong as any league in the country. The Pac-12, I wouldn't even put in this argument right now, but the Big 12, the SEC 1 through 14, I would still consider to be the deepest and the most quality.
The deepest I could see, the most quality. For me, I'd have a problem putting them there just for the pure fact of what Auburn did last year. LSU looked like I want to say LSU was pretty easily the second best team in the SEC last year. That was kind of proven by what they did against Louisville. Again, if they can just get the offense going, they competed with Alabama. That's not something that Auburn really did. I still like the SEC this year. They do just beat up on each other a whole lot. The SEC East has dropped off quite a bit from the SEC West, but the Georgia and Florida are still there in the top 25 and are still at least nationally relevant. We'll see where Florida's at really on Saturday when they face Michigan. We had two teams that have a lot of question marks. I think that'll be a big decider.
Yeah. So Andrew, so you're putting a lot of stock in the preseason rankings, and so that's. If I understand the argument, that's why you've dropped the SEC to the 4th place ranking right now until some of those teams prove that that they're better than that.
Yeah, I think that even with the teams that are higher or that are ranked a little bit higher in the preseason poll, the Auburns, the LSUs, they have quite a few question marks, especially compared to some of the teams ranked around them. I like what Georgia has going on with the offense right now. Jacob Eason, stable running backs they have, Sonny Michel, Nick Chubb, obviously very solid. But I think if Jarrett Stidham doesn't work out, Auburn will not have a good season. If Matt Canada doesn't work out over at LSU, then they're in trouble as well. At least they'll put themselves in the same boat that they were for the last couple of years. I think the SEC, once they're doubted to this degree, will kind of prove how dominant they can actually be. But where they're sitting right now, I think at the top of the conference, I don't know if they measure up. I guess it's just picking apples to oranges here between the Pac-12 and the SEC for me at the top. But outside of Bama, I just don't know where the competition lies in the SEC.
So if we had Alabama match up against USC, and we saw that game a year ago, let's throw it out. No Sam Darnold. They're two different teams right now, but we'll throw those two out because, as I'm understanding, you're looking at the Pac-12 seeds 2 through whatever matching up against the SEC. So you'd be comfortable with Washington, Stanford, Oregon, UCLA, Utah, those teams playing LSU and Auburn, Georgia, Florida?
I would take, for me, Stanford's, I really buy into what Stanford's got right now. I like Keller Chris, Bryce Love. I think he's a stud also. I know it's not really something you can tell with their week 0 performance against Rice.
Sure.
But I do think Stanford would be a quality opponent for whatever second place team you would want to put. Washington, just after John Ross leaves, I'm not ready to put them even as the second best team. Again, this is just my thinking here. Washington, they made a big run at things last year, but they kind of got exposed almost at the end of the season last year, facing quality opponents like USC during their hot streak and Alabama in the semifinal for the playoff. They just had a really easy schedule up to that point. I would still feel comfortable with Washington facing a team like Auburn. Alabama dominated Auburn almost to the same degree that they beat Washington. And then Georgia, Florida, to that degree, maybe putting them against a Washington State or a Colorado right now. I'd be comfortable with those matchups. I think you could slot some pretty good matchups in there. The SEC, you still have the brand names coming along with it. I think that you play any team at the top of the SEC, you're always going to have a dogfight, and we'll learn a lot with a lot of the early season matchups in the SEC, Michigan, Florida being one of those. I think another one to watch really is that Tennessee, Georgia Tech, see where Tennessee's at this year. Another team that gets a lot of preseason hype.
Andrew Miller joining us from Fansided. You can also catch his work on Saturday Blitz. Unfortunately, we just don't have the matchups to make the comparison between the SEC and the Pac-12. So off the top of my head, we've got UCLA at the Rose Bowl taking on Texas A&M. So that's a bit of a barometer there, but we're sliding down the scale to probably the 6th or 7th best teams in the conferences, but it's a like-seeded matchup we would expect. So it should be a decent game like it was last year at Kyle Field in an overtime win for the Aggies. But besides that, I think that's pretty much it between the SEC and the Pac-12. Obviously, the barometer comes between the SEC and the ACC in particular because they just play so many games against each other. You've got all those November matchups with the rivalries of Georgia, Georgia Tech, Florida, Florida State, Louisville, Kentucky, and the other one I'm forgetting right now. So you've got a number of matchups there to rate those conferences. So yeah, Tennessee, Georgia Tech's going to tell us something. Of course, Georgia's going to Notre Dame in week 2 or 3. The Auburn-Clemson game should be interesting as Clemson won the matchup last year, but now Auburn's got to go to Clemson. Of course, Alabama-Florida State's a huge game that's going to give us some level of play at that point. South Carolina, North Carolina State, one of those games to kind of test out the middle of each conference as well. So we're going to know a whole lot more about all these conferences after non-conference play. But right now, I'm not thinking that the Pac-12 would stand a chance against the SEC if you matched up the top 7 or 8 teams. But we're just kicking it around, Andrew. We've got nothing to base this on. Hardly anything at this point because they just haven't hit the field. But I'm going to love LSU, Georgia, Auburn, those teams going up against the likes of Washington State and Colorado.
Yeah, you compare the teams, and for me, I would like Washington State over a team like Florida. I don't know if a Florida team could keep up with Luke Falk. Unless they can find a quarterback this year, Florida's offense has had trouble keeping up with any good offensive opponent. Along with that, Colorado's a tough team to figure out. Will they be as good as they were last year? They had a good run with Mike McIntyre, but Sefo Liufau's gone. They're testing out a new quarterback in Steven Montez, who doesn't have a whole lot of proven experience. They've got a lot of good weapons around him. I'm a big fan of Phillip Lindsay. I saw him play against Oklahoma State last year, tough runner, and a guy that could easily get over 1,500 yards, 15 to 20 touchdowns sort of guy. But Pac-12 is a conference that you'll figure out later in the season how good they can actually be. Just not a whole lot of the teams there have tough non-conference schedules.
Yeah, I am kind of thinking that if we saw Washington State play one of the teams that you're talking about, Florida or Georgia, we'd see a similar outcome maybe than we saw in the Holiday Bowl when Minnesota beat Washington State, when Washington State was a double-digit favorite and had the glossy passing numbers with Luke Falk at the controls, but Minnesota just beat them up. They just punched them in the mouth, and I think Georgia and Florida would be able to do that, plus some with the athleticism and the speed that they have against a team like Washington State. I do like the Stanford team. I do like the matchup there. I would love to see Stanford play LSU or Auburn or Florida. I would love to see that matchup in particular, but the rest of the Pac-12 has to be proven to me to be much of a fight against an SEC team. But again, unfortunately, we're not going to see those matchups until hopefully a college football playoff appearance by somebody.
Yes, we'll see if the Pac-12 is that conference left out of the playoff this year. It's hard to see the SEC left out of the playoff. That's the tough part when you compare the Pac-12 and the SEC. You just don't see any scenario where the SEC is left out of the playoff. Pac-12 and Big 12 are, say, 95% chance the conferences that are going to be left out of the playoff, either or.
Have you made any predictions?
Yeah, I don't like staying with the top 4. It's just I don't feel like there's any way that's actually going to happen at the end of the year, especially with Alabama and Florida State playing each other in week 1. I mean, if the loser ends up winning out, then they'll make it into the playoff. But I like Oklahoma out of the Big 12. If not that, then Oklahoma State. I would love to see my alma mater in the playoff, but most of all, I just like to see the Big 12 in the playoff right now. And I think for me, it comes down to the Oklahoma schools.
Okay. So you're liking the Oklahoma State winner. If Alabama or Florida State, whoever loses that game, you're not too confident that they can come back and make it.
I can see a 1-loss Alabama team coming back to do it, but I don't see a 1 or 2-loss Florida State team, even if they win the ACC title, making it into the playoff. I don't see any 2-loss team making it into the playoff regardless.
Yeah, hasn't happened yet through 3 seasons, so I'm sure that trend's going to be bucked at some point, but it's unlikely. All right, Andrew Miller from Fansided and Saturday Blitz joining us to talk up the SEC. Andrew, we appreciate the time.
Of course. Always happy to talk college football.